What was your first impression of Paul Greyrat? Was it good? Was it bad? Was it really bad? Yeah. The first few episodes of us getting to know this man didn't exactly do wonders for our impressions of him. If there were words to describe him based on my first impressions, I'd say they'd be stubborn, childish, show-off, impulsive, cheating bastard, womanizer, and bad father. This consensus is not just shared among us, the viewer, but also the people in that world. They either regard him as some bold, daring, rash man, or a failure of a person, whether it be Lilia and her past with him, Zenith and his former adventuring party members, or even his noble relatives. It was always one or the other, a charming scoundrel or a disgrace to his name. But these traits were born long before the Paul Greyrat that we know, and to see that, we need to look into his untold origin story. Quick disclaimer, this video will be my telling of Paul's origin story without spoiling any content beyond the anime. I will do this by drawing information from volumes 1 to 6 of the light novels, the wiki, and the mobile game. This game includes 2 scenarios, Paul Gaiden Runaway Arc and Paul Gaiden Training Arc, both of which were supervised by the author. However, this video will focus on the Paul Gaiden Runaway Arc. Furthermore, during my research in the making of the script, I am very much aware of the discrepancies and inconsistencies that exist between the official light novel and this game. However, I will still be treating these scenarios as an extension of his story and try to summarize their events while also highlighting information I deem important to his story. Furthermore, I wanted to give credit to Reddit user handle Fudo123 and everyone involved with the creation of this fan translation of the Paul Gaiden Runaway Arc. I highly recommend you read through the wiki and this document yourself, as there are a lot of little nuances and details I could not include in this video, and it's honestly a great read. Links for both will be in the description. Lastly, although this video can serve as a standalone video for those who wish to learn more about Paul, I made this with the intention of it being the first part of a 3-part series on Paul Greyrat, the second part of which will go into Paul Gaiden Training Arc and his adventuring days, and lastly, the third part will conclude this series with a full analysis of his character as a whole, so look forward to it. Paul Greyrat, born as Paul Notos Greyrat, was the eldest son of one of the most powerful noble families in the Asuran Kingdom, a country notorious for its ruthless politics. For context, the Greyrat family was divided into 4 houses: Notos, Boreos, Euros, and Zephyrus. Each house was in charge of all sides of the Asuran Kingdom. The Notos family was in charge of the entire Milbots region, and its current head at the time of Paul's birth was Amarant Notos Greyrat, Paul's father. And by carrying the name of Notos Greyrat came with expectations, like being tied to nobility, tradition, and social conduct. However, Paul could never seem to conform to such duties, as even at a young age, he was already neglecting his lessons and getting into trouble around the mansion where he lived. And by trouble, I mean messing around with the maids that worked there, like hiding under their skirts to escape his lessons, or just because. This and other reasons led to a rocky relationship with his father, but it wasn't all spite at first. In the beginning, Amarant's treatment of Paul, although seeming strict at first, is rather lenient. Unsurprisingly, as is common with the Greyrat family, their tendencies to be skirt chasers were a shared trait between father and son, but that didn't stop Amarant from trying to rein in Paul's antics, and tried to get him to act more noble, as is expected of the eldest and only son. However, during these times of active mischief and rebellion, Paul loved his mother, Valentina Notos Greyrat. In contrast to everyone else in the mansion, she loved her son's free-spirited nature and loved him unconditionally, although she gently taught him to show respect towards girls. She remained Paul's sole ally in a household growing increasingly frustrated with him. If it wasn't for her, who knows what levels of degeneracy Paul would have reached now. However, his father was not done with him, and after his 5th birthday party, tricked him into going to school. It was here where Paul's innate nature clashed with the stifling ideals of school, specifically noble schools, and his first experience with the ugly nature of nobility. During his time there, he would mostly be skipping class, and as a result of that, he was mostly alone with no friends. However, this allowed him to witness various incidents, such as nobles using their higher status to harass nobles of lower rank. Paul never liked this, and at some point stepped into one incident where they tried to harass a lesser noble. Ironically, however, Paul ended the argument by revealing his full name. Whether he intended to intimidate them by declaring his stronger lineage or not, it backfired. Paul, who didn't understand the complexities of noble hierarchies, was left confused when the very person he saved ended up running away from him. The lesser noble, learning of Paul's powerful background, decided not to take any chances of getting involved with him. But this thought process made little sense to Paul, as he didn't see why people needed to act so cautiously around each other, and all Paul wanted was a friend. However, this didn't stop him from skipping class, except for swordsmanship. The reason why Paul is such a badass when it comes to swordsmanship is because his interest in it started early. There, he was introduced to the world of swordsmanship, specifically the water god style, under the guidance of a female instructor who taught it. However, this very teacher called Paul out on his BS, having noticed he'd been skipping all other classes and only showing up to hers. When confronted, Paul begrudgingly acknowledged her point and agreed to try attending more classes, though he remained firm on one thing: he refused to learn magic, claiming it was pointless. This sparked a stern reprimand from the instructor. Paul, in turn, tried to justify himself, explaining how he had been forced into the school and how demoralizing it was to live with the dynamics of noble hierarchies. But to her, it was the complaint of a pampered noble child. However, the main takeaway of her lecture was that Paul was still naive. What he saw in the school directly reflected how nobles behave in the real world, and while he might hate it, this was the world he was born into. If he truly couldn't accept that, then it was up to him to carve out his own path. The only question was, did he have the courage to do that, even when escape wasn't an option? And Paul, realizing how spoiled his way of thinking was, and mostly because he was just a kid, cried. If it wasn't for her, Paul's mindset would have been closed off to the realities of this world, and with the lecture his instructor gave him in mind, he began to attend his other lessons, but with a main focus on his swordsmanship. However, when Paul returned home for a holiday break, his father was furious. He had learned that Paul was skipping class and his poor grades. For the first time, Paul saw his father speak to him not as a parent, but as a cold, uncompromising noble patriarch. This was the first turning point down the strict warpath of whipping him into shape, and the alienation between his relationship of him and Paul. Amaranth's first course of action was to hire private tutors to drill Paul in academics anytime he was on vacation from school. Much to Paul's annoyance, he had to put up with this routine for around 2 years. However, this did come with its benefits, as at home he had a different female swordswoman teach him another style, the sword god style. However, during one of his days off from school, Valentina announced to Paul that she was pregnant with a second child. Paul congratulated his mother, but his feelings of jealousy were creeping up on him, as the full attention that had always been his was now directed toward the unborn baby. He began to fear that with a new heir on the way, his existence was fading in his family's eyes, and these fears were starting to materialize, as not long after, Valentina gave birth to a baby boy, Philemon Notos Greyrat. As the mansion began to grow on the second child of the Notos family, and his mother's attention was prioritized on the baby, this brought more unease for Paul, as he couldn't spend more quality time with just him and his mom, especially considering how he had mostly been at school and how cold his father had been lately. You could chalk this up to him just being selfish, but he was still a kid. He knew his mother wanted him to get along with his baby brother and be a good example, and Paul, if not for anyone else, always wanted to fulfill his mom's wishes as much as he could, but he couldn't help feeling these negative thoughts. After a few more years, Paul was now 10, and this is where the bulk of the turning points and character developments were thrown at him. However, one positive from this early on was proof that his talents with the sword were no joke. Despite being only 10, he was already impressively skilled in both the water god and sword god styles, blending both of them as he refined them with his unorthodox discipline. Most nobles focus entirely on the water god style, as it was a defensive art associated with prestige and discipline, but Paul, being Paul, naturally leaned more toward the offense-oriented sword god style, not because he thought it through, but because it was simply in his nature to be aggressive and direct. Ironically, he didn't even realize this about himself, which only reinforced that it was just who he was at his core. But as his 10th birthday party rolled by, instead of feeling happy, he felt quite the opposite. His mother had to take her leave early to care for a sick Philemon, and Amaranth spent the party attending to guests, paying almost no attention to Paul on his special day. It was here that we learned that he had a quite amicable relationship with a familiar character, Philip Boreas Greyrat, who came over to cheer him up. They both went to the same school and shared similar proclivities, mostly with women. This was all well and good until Philip's older brother, James Boreas Greyrat, called Paul a problematic child of the Notos family who only knows how to use a sword and not how to be a noble, highlighting how Paul's reputation was perceived outside of his mansion. But after their little spat, leaving Paul simmering, Philip then encouraged Paul to relax and enjoy the party, and tried to dance with one of the many young ladies at the party. Taking that advice, Paul invited a pretty girl to dance. The lady who reciprocated happened to be a person who had history with him. Paul's heart pounded with an unfamiliar excitement as they dance. When the girl coyly invited him to an empty room to rest, Paul followed. There, in an isolated room, Paul experienced his first kiss, and more, with the noble girl losing his virginity at only 10 years old. It was an awakening for him, and the birth of something much worse. After that night, the thrill of rebellion overtook him. Paul's time at school was now mostly him chasing that exhilarating feeling, indulging in promiscuity with several willing aristocratic girls his age at school. But inevitably, scandal followed. A noble boy stormed in on Paul, enraged that he had seduced his fiancée, and demanded a duel. Paul refused to apologize, claiming that she had consented. Paul was also calling the bluff on his challenge, as he was confident he would win the duel with ease, and that in such terms, death was a real possibility on either side. The boy backed down, but the story spread. spread, reaching the ears of many and eventually Amaranth. Within a week, Paul was abruptly summoned home. Amaranth confronted his 10-year-old son with a cold, boiling fury. He struck Paul across the face, the first time he had ever hit him, and scolded him not for womanizing per se, but for failing to understand the political consequences of his actions. Paul's reckless trysts had offended families with ties to theirs and jeopardized the Nota's reputation, but Paul was honestly confused by the heavy-handed approach his father was handing him, because he saw it as natural for someone from the Greyrat family. He thought that's exactly what his father wanted him to do, as it would help him in his future. Furthermore, Paul called him out, saying that he had done the same thing before. However, Amaranth made a cold but reasonable sounding argument, in that the women he gets closer to are all done with the intention of getting his hands on information on their families. What Paul is doing is simply for the fun of it, which would simply make him a sexual deviant. Damn. Paul had no response because it was in fact true that he was doing this for fun. Finally, Amaranth declared that Paul would be confined to his room indefinitely. Thus began Paul's house arrest. In these depressing times, the only person who still loved him unequivocally was his mother. Valentina was visiting Paul in secret each night to comfort him. She pleaded with Amaranth to forgive their son, but Amaranth's heart had hardened. Valentina assured Paul that despite his sternness, his father still loves him and expects him to become the head of the Nota's family someday. She insisted that Amaranth didn't want him to be troubled as the future head of the Nota's Greyrat family, which is why he's being strict with him. Paul, despite everything, wanted to hear those words directly from Amaranth. He told his mother that he would try, truly try, to fit into the aristocratic world if it meant earning his father's acceptance, and mostly because his mother's wishes were just that important to him. However, not long after, Valentina's secret visits stopped without explanation, and she never showed up again since then. Paul couldn't stand not knowing what was happening, as no one told him anything about the affairs happening outside the house. Eventually, he managed to convince his old nanny, who was now the head maid, and was one of the maids he messed around with the most since a young age, for news. There, he learned that his mother was gravely ill, and growing weaker by the day despite all the doctors Amaranth had summoned. Paul was shocked and angry with himself, as during her last visit, he had sensed something was wrong and done nothing. He had been too self-absorbed in her kindness to realize his mother was dying. Paul then came up with a plan to escape his locked room that very night, and when he made it to her room, Paul finally got an idea of his mother's condition. The room reeked of medicine, and she was lying deathly still. Paul quickly confirmed that she was all skin and bones, and the thought of the weird sensation he experienced when he hugged his mother that time and realized that she had already been getting sick since then. He even tried a basic healing spell he'd learned, one of the few bits of magic he knew, but when this proved useless, he went to his father's study to apologize to him. Amaranth accepted his apology easily enough, and Amaranth agreed to lift the house arrest on one condition. Paul was forbidden from ever visiting his mother. Amaranth claimed that Valentina's overindulgence of Paul had caused his terrible behavior. Amaranth then dismissed Paul without even telling him how dire Valentina's condition truly was. And sure enough, right as Paul left, he overheard his father and a butler. They were talking about a doctor who was supposed to arrive here to treat Valentina, but had wandered off to the slums on the way to the mansion. By the way they were discussing this, it seemed like this doctor had some special expertise that they thought would help in curing Valentina, and Paul, clinging to that sliver of hope, snuck out to the city slums at the next opportunity, searching for this miracle doctor. However, this search proved futile. No one knew of any such doctor, but that night, while returning to the manor empty-handed, Paul imagined he heard his mother's voice calling his name, which sent him sprinting back to her room. But by the time Paul returned home, Valentina had passed away. He found Amaranth and Philemon weeping by the bedside, but when he tried to approach his mother's body, Philemon screamed at him to stay away, blaming Paul for her death. Amaranth agreed with Philemon. He spat venomous accusations claiming Valentina's health failed because of the grief and stress he had caused, tied with the fact that she was weak-bodied to begin with. He revealed that he knew of his mother's secret visits to Paul during his house arrests and used that as another reason to blame him. Paul, in further disbelief, never knew that his mother was sickly from the start. He never once thought that he was hurting her. It was there that Amaranth gave an order as the head of the household and forbade Paul from seeing his mother's face again until her funeral. After Valentina's death, his father gave up on him entirely and shifting all of his attention to Philemon. This shift in dynamic affected even the servants, who began to treat Paul differently. The home he was born and raised in no longer felt familiar or welcoming. It had become cold and distant. It was so bad that Paul chose to return to school of his own accord. Yet, being surrounded by noble kids there made it feel no different from home. In the end, Paul dropped out before he even turned 12. And not long after, the Nota's family held a lavish celebration for Philemon's 5th birthday. Paul, now nothing more than a background figure figure in his own home only confirmed how far he had fallen in status. The same noble girl who had once shown him affection and taken his virginity now wanted nothing to do with him, rushing off to entertain Philemon. Paul's frustrations didn't end there, as Philemon, the golden child of the household, approached Paul with a smile for the crowd, but his words were sharp and cold in private, telling him to get lost as no one wants him there. Realizing there was no place for him at the celebration, he walked away, not just from the party, but from everything. In that moment, Paul's distaste for noble society crystallized into something more: hatred. Paul justified his actions based only on whether it was fun for him or if it aroused him. He knew it was wild and impulsive, but he also knew that it was his way of staying true to himself. Paul simply couldn't fathom how being so crafty would be any fun. However, nobility was not just boring, it was disgusting. A world of status-obsessed egotists who discarded others the moment they lost their usefulness. Paul had always felt out of place, but now he truly understood why. That very night, Paul slipped away from the estate and wandered towards the slums. There, he was confronted by a group of thugs, and without hesitation, he lashed out, unleashing all his pent-up frustrations with nothing but his fists. This was a defining moment for him. From that point forward, he cast aside the world of nobles and chose instead to immerse himself in the streets. Throughout his time in the slums, which involved him getting jumped by thugs after his money due to his noble appearance, was a time of growth for him. The first aspect was his skills. Because he dropped out of school, he hadn't had the opportunity to practice his swordsmanship in earnest, so him being attacked was the perfect time to hone his skill.
This cycle of days fighting to take back his stuff, winning, only to come back and lose it again, to then return to fight once more, continued.
Slowly, a reputation began to form and earned him the title, the eccentric noble brat. The next aspect was his experience in bed. In contrast to the carefully postured women of noble society, Paul found the women of the slums bold, honest, and far more exciting. Their teasing, their lack of pretense, and their comfort with who they were, Paul was drawn to the liberating aspect of it all. However, the women respected him for treating them as equals, not like disposable toys like most nobles do. But the last and most important aspect was his self-worth. His escapades caught the attention of a local gang led by a rough but charismatic kid named Lud. Paul fought Lud's gang off one by one until Lud himself stepped forward. What followed was an all-out brawl that stretched over days. For Paul, he went along with this because he was eyeing a girl around his age who was hiding behind Lud, whom we learn is Marianne, Lud's younger sister. But what turned from a reckless display of strength turned into something much more. It was pure freedom. No status, no reputation, just sword against sword. By the 10th day, Paul won, and Lud, who had wagered his position as the boss of the slum gang over that fight, handed it over. But leadership wasn't so simple. Paul found himself in an unfamiliar role, unsure of how to guide others and the responsibilities that came with it. When Marianne noticed his unease during a moment of doubt, Paul opened up about the guilt he felt. He gave her a summary of his family affairs, but refrained from revealing too much, avoiding names and specifics. He did, however, speak about one particular maid, the one person back home who never turned her back on him. She had always waited up for him when he came home late and bloodied, and always tried to get him to reconcile with his father. Just recently, she'd begged him to join an inspection ride with his father in Philemon. Paul had stood waiting at the entrance hall, trying to honor her wishes, only to be completely ignored by Amaranth. Furthermore, she steeled herself to speak her mind on the affairs between Paul and Amaranth. Paul told Marianne how that moment crushed him. He feared that if she lost her job because of him, he wouldn't be able to help her. He wouldn't be able to take responsibility, and that helplessness truly frightened him.
This notion of him fearing this sense of responsibility for the maid, tied in with his unease with his new role as a leader, weighed heavily on Paul.
However, Marianne listened and patiently reassured Paul. She found comfort in knowing that someone like Paul, who seemed so strong and confident, could also feel fear and uncertainty. For the first time in a while, someone had seen through his bravado and acknowledged the fear behind it. Her gentle reassurances gave Paul something he hadn't felt in a long time: safety, and something to look forward to when coming home.
With this and the help of the people around him, Paul was able to act on his duties as the head of the group with a clear mind.
Paul was surrounded by people who depended on him, and whom he could depend on, not out of obligation, but out of trust. Unlike the nobles, they didn't belittle him or dismiss him, and that simple respect began to rebuild his sense of self-worth. With that, he stepped more fully into a new outlook on life, one where he could do things how he wanted, and fight for things he cared for. However, Paul's secret life would be exposed before long, as one night when he returned to the manor,
he was surprised to hear that he had been summoned by his father. When he arrived,
Amaranth's face was seething. However, something was different this time, because without a word, Amaranth closed in and slapped Paul, snarling that Paul had robbed the light from this house and now was dragging the note to was named through the mud. Paul protested. For one, he was pissed that Amaranth was referring to his mother as this light, and secondly, he saw no reason for Amaranth to even care as he had been ignoring him this whole time. In the middle of this, Pillarman interjected, telling Paul that they were nobles and that they should act like one. Paul immediately lashed out, telling them he didn't choose to be a noble, nor did he like being one. This caused Amaranth to strike him again. Amaranth told Paul that no one gets to choose how they were born,
and that's why he tried to raise him as the eldest son of the family.
But Paul wasn't buying it. As far as he was concerned, Amaranth had stopped being a father the day Valentina died. Once again, amid their argument, Pillarman instigated, telling Paul to give up and that nothing was going to go his way. This was where Pillarman's true intentions began to show, as he said aloud, "I saw it, you know. Big Brother has been coming and going from the slums, right?" It was starting to get clearer for us and Paul that Pillarman was the one to instigate this conflict by ratting Paul out to their father. This was all happening so fast that Paul couldn't give his side of the story, and one look at Pillarman's face would tell you that he wanted all of this to happen. Over time, Pillarman began to replace Paul in every way, first in affection, then in attention, and finally in legacy. It was clear he wasn't an innocent younger brother. He was staking his claim to the Nodos name. Things escalated quickly, and Amaranth once again ordered Paul to be placed under house arrest. But this time, Paul refused. He had experienced real freedom. Being a leader in the slums, living by his own rules, and relying on his strength to face whatever came had shown him something worth fighting for. There were no lies and no noble hypocrisy. He would not be locked away, and he no longer considered that house his home. Pillarman wasn't finished, telling Paul to stop being stubborn, and brought up Valentina into this, trying to guilt trip and blame Paul for her death. This was the last straw for Paul. He lunged at Pillarman and gave that little a proper beating. Paul hated that Pillarman was using his mother's name with bad intentions, and the fact was, Pillarman never experienced her full kindness like he did. But as Amaranth tried to stop this, he was met with a glare so intense that it made him hesitate. But after he tore Paul off Pillarman, shouted that Paul was just jealous that he and Valentina loved Pillarman more, and that Paul was using her name as an excuse to lash out at Pillarman. Paul denied it flat out. "There's nothing in this house worth being jealous of," he said. "This isn't my home." Amaranth exploded, and whether in the heat of the moment or not, declared Pillarman as the one to succeed him and told Paul to leave their home. And Paul did. He walked out without hesitation. He gladly threw away the name of Notos Greyrat. "It's not like I liked living here anyway," he said. "I refuse to live and die in such a narrow-minded world." The servants tried to stop him, and so Paul, weaving between the servants with footwork so skilled due to all of his training that even Amaranth was shocked to see how efficient his movements were. It made him wonder one last time what Paul's true strengths were, and just like that, at the age of 12, Paul walked away from the life he was born into. But before he left for good, he thought of his mother. Would she be angry with him for walking away from his family, or would she smile and tell him it was okay? Either way, he knew now. This house, this name, this world of nobles, it was never meant for him. And with that, under the quiet glow of starlight, he fled the manor that had never truly been a home, not once looking back. After I finished reading these chapters of his life, I came to understand Paul's character as a whole a lot more than I did before. From subtle details like his skill with the sword, his strained relationship with his father and how that carries on to his current traits, his inclinations towards being a womanizer and helpless sexual deviant, which even then was slightly curbed by his respect for his mother and the significant positive impact she had on his life, to his aversion towards nobility, which in turn led him down a path of doing things on his own terms. This was where his lifestyle was born, and it didn't stop there. Thank you for watching. It really has been too long since the last time I uploaded anything. There are various reasons and excuses as to why this happened, but in short, it involved a lot of priorities of mine being rearranged, which also includes financial aspects, and regrettably, this meant I had to sacrifice my attention for this channel. And for that, I truly apologize to all of you. However, I'm now back with the full intention of getting back on my horse with this YouTube channel. I want to do right by you guys this time, but I would rather prove this with actions instead of words. Please look forward to the continuation of this 3-part series I've created for Paul's character. I'll see you then.